Rice also in 1997 began operating a sort of a series of technical courses through continuing studies so that people could learn how to program and repair computers. A quite successful thing. Anyway, in 1998, the School of Continuing Studies celebrated its 30th anniversary. And in those 30 years, something like 155,000 students had taken courses in the continuing studies. The total number of living Rice alums is somewhere in the neighborhood of 45,000. Is that right, Ann? In that neighborhood? 40,000, total number of living alums. And since 1968, the School of Continuing Studies has enrolled 154,000. Actually, up now, it's right at 175,000. So it's amazing when you walk throughout the community, you meet people wherever you go who will say, you know, oh, I took your continuing studies class. And you often don't know who they are because you're not taking roll, not having exams and so forth. But I mean, you more often meet someone who's a Rice alum through continuing studies than who's a Rice alum by getting a BA or some other degree. Another way that Rice has really reached out in a way that's had an amazing impact on the university and on the community, and I think really on the city, is the Baker Institute. The Baker Institute for Public Policy. The idea began to sort of germinate in the minds of some people in political science here in 1992. An initial reaching out was made to James Baker in 1992, and then that was really announced in 1993. And then it was a groundbreaking in 1994, and then finally a couple of years later the building was opened, and opened with the director, Ed Durigian, an ambassador. And the Baker Institute for Public Policy is intended to sort of bridge the world between the sort of academic world of ideas and the world of practice in business and in government and in politics. It's a non-degree granting agency, but it hopes to bring researchers and people who practice all kinds of public policy programs and academicians to come to Rice. And they have programs on, you know, oil policy in China and Mexico and urban crime and fiscal policy, but it has tremendously broadened the range of speakers who come to the Rice campus. And it has, in some sense, sort of made Rice made Houston a sort of a stopping point for world figures who are coming to the United States, and they will sort of work in a trip to Rice. And if you've been a student here for the last, if you've been around for the last decade or so, you know from everything from Gorbachev to I'm beginning to even announce all the Colin Powell. It's just amazing the amount of people, the variety of people who address the Rice students and meet the Rice faculty. And the Baker Institute has very significantly expanded the kind of image of Rice as an institution other than science engineering. I just, by happenstance today, had lunch with someone in the admissions office, and they're talking about how many more applicants they're getting and how many really good applicants they're getting in political science. And they relate that exactly to people around the nation interested in public policy. They and their advisors and so forth are aware of the Baker Institute. Another way that Rice got involved in the larger community is one of those kinds of so-Texas ideas. There was a young student at Rice who graduated in the class of 1920 named Albert Thomas. And one of his roommates for a year or so was George Brown. George Brown didn't graduate from Rice, but he went here long enough for us to count him an alum. Anyway, so Albert Thomas and George Brown became friends. And Albert Thomas later became a congressman representing Houston. And Albert Thomas was one of those congressmen who was not particularly interested in sort of formulating grand ideas about national policy, but he saw his role as to help his town. And he just became a congressman in the late 30s after Houston had suffered a great flood. Maybe you've seen stories of a great flood in the 1930s where water was 3 feet deep on Main Street downtown. And one of the first things he began to do was develop flood control way out I-10. You can see some results of that now. And then he became a great advocate of improving and deepening and widening and whatever it needed the Houston Ship Channel. So Albert Thomas from the very beginning saw his role as not simply constituent service, but in bringing federal funds to help Houston. And he had a very good friend in George Brown, who had a very good friend, Lyndon B. Johnson. And in the late 50s, there was a desire on the part of Albert Thomas and LBJ and George Brown and Rice University to attract some kind of government lab, some kind of government laboratory. I mean, they knew, like, the Lawrence, they knew that those kind of great research laboratories in California and so forth brought money and prestige. And Rice was Houston was, of course, a great center for geology. So there were a lot of sort of noise in the late 1950s about trying to attract some kind of government geological laboratory that Rice would somehow be involved in. That didn't pan out. But in 1957, Russia launched Sputnik. And it became a great American goal to catch up with the Russians and not be left behind with all the kind of, Cold War stuff behind that. Well, about 1960, the U.S. government, and speeding up in 1961, began to think about creating a center, the idea of placing a man on the moon. And this would be a great national adventure. But it would be a scientific adventure. It would be an adventure in sort of showing the Russians that we could do anything too. And remember that the sort of formal announcement of that effort to put a man on the moon was made at the Rice Stadium when, in September 1962, I believe it was, John Kennedy came and stood out there on the west side of the stadium and said that man's always climbed why are we going to do this? And why does a man climb Mount Everest? Why do we swim the ocean? Why does Rice play Texas? He said that in his talk. And so we're going to put a man on the moon. Now, as part of this agency to put a man on the moon, they had decided they needed some center where they could coordinate the research and engineering and training activities associated with putting a man on the moon. Now, the man who was head of the congressional committee that funded NASA was Albert Thomas, whose good friend was George Brown, who was president of Brown and Root, the nation's largest construction company, who was a good friend with LBJ, who was vice president. And so NASA, in thinking about a location for building a manned space center, and what I'm going to say, I think, is going to sound like rationalization, because it just sounds like, well, NASA came to Houston because of these friendships. But NASA laid out in 1961, when it first began to think about a manned spacecraft center, that it should be a place in sort of an all-weather terrain so you could train astronauts and so forth, so you wouldn't choose like northern Minnesota. They already knew that the launching place was going to be Cape Canaveral, later, of course, came named Cape Kennedy. And they wanted to sort of spread the largesse, and the American sort of government rocketry stuff was headquartered in Huntsville, Alabama. And they had decided they were going to build these great rockets, the fuel controlling containers, at a Michaud plant near New Orleans that had been a World War II plant. And so the idea was you needed a warm weather place, and it'd be ideal at this place because they could all be connected by barge or something, in case you wanted to ship rockets back and forth. And so, of course, Houston was on the Intercoastal Canal, and it certainly had warm weather in the winter. And they also wanted to be a place with a large city, because they assumed that only a large city would have sort of the infrastructure and jobs for spouses and educational and so forth that a large government agency would need. And they also wanted it to be a location with at least one major research university. Well, you begin to think about the South, large urban area, access to the Intercoastal Canal with a research university. And they also wanted to have a military base nearby, and Ellington Air Force Base was, And so actually all the kind of criteria that the government spelled out they wanted perfectly fit Houston. Now, the question is, did they come up with the criteria after they had chosen Houston? Or did they come up with the criteria and Houston just seemed to fit it? I prefer to think the first, but I think it was really important that the person heading the committee was Albert Thomas, a Rice graduate, whose whole goal was to sort of bring the bacon home to his community. Anyway, lo and behold, in 1962, the federal government announced that the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center would be located near Houston. And what really sort of sealed the deal is that Rice University gave NASA the land. In part because Humble Oil, that owned the land all around there, had given the land to Rice so that Rice could give the land to NASA. And the surrounding 25,000, 30,000 acres of land, Humble still owned. And hence it, of course, created a home building company, and Clear Lake City arose. And then Brown and Root got the contract to build the Manned Spacecraft Center. It's just amazing how smoothly everything worked. But I think it's quite clear that NASA wouldn't have come to Houston without those variety of Rice connections. Albert Thomas, Rice had a PhD program in physics, and Rice founded, just in advance of NASA, what they called the nation's first PhD program in space science. And then, Rice gave him the land. So in some important way, NASA came to Houston because of Rice's complicated involvement. Now, again, NASA had probably a larger role, a sort of a larger impact on Houston, sort of intellectually or in public relations than in reality. I mean, if you will, in Houston in the 1960s, when the Manned Space Center came here, you would have the idea it's going to bring in 400,000 jobs and so forth. But in fact, NASA never has very many employees. I mean, NASA had at the most something like 7,000 employees. The Medical Center has 55,000. So the real impact in terms of jobs and so forth of NASA has been relatively small. It didn't have that kind of, it didn't sort of change the whole nature. Houston didn't become a high-tech rather than a petroleum center instantly. On the other hand, as you know, the first word spoken by humans from the surface of the moon, Houston, the eagle has landed. The first word spoken by humans on the surface of the moon was Houston. And that wouldn't have happened if Rice hadn't somehow been involved in NASA. Now, so Rice, of course, then Rice has experiments on the moon and all kinds of things, and has had a continued research relationship. And then Rice owned the West Mansion, 10, 11 acres next to the Manned Spacecraft Center, where the Lunar Science Institute was established. And so when they find evidence, of life on Mars, it's at the Lunar Science Institute, and the scientist who announces it had gotten his degrees from Rice. In the last 10 or 15 years, Rice has reached out to, in a way never before in its past, to high schools and to elementary schools. Rice became very aware in the 80s that one of the obligations of a private research university was to the K through 12 public schooling in the community. And you would be just flabbergasted to go through, if I were to list all the activities that Rice has with high schools, the Rice Mathematics Project, the Rice Model Science Lab. There's a little book in one of the offices at Rice called Rice University Educational Outreach Programs. And this book describes 58 distinct outreach programs to K through 12 schools from Houston to Brownsville. I was amazed reading this myself, how many ways Rice is serving the community. But Rice has served the community not just from lectures in the very beginning or athletic contests and music and so forth and, bringing NASA to Rice. But now Rice is getting ready to spread its influence to Europe. And it happened in a really unusual way I want to talk about a little bit. And this is a new idea called International University Bremen, that if it works out, is going to be one of the most astounding, amazing ways in which Rice is going to sort of help shape, maybe reshape, European higher education. In 1938, Hitler, in the outskirts of the town of Bremen in North Germany, established a military base that was a training base for German logistic officers. It was a 75-acre base, and since it was to train just officers, it was nice. I mean, beautiful brick buildings with stone door jambs and so forth, and there were athletic fields and gymnasiums and, you know, dormitories and so forth, and classrooms and trees planted. It was it's a very attractive military base. In fact, it looks like a campus, not a military base. Of course, as you know, Germany lost World War II. And so that base was taken over by the Americans. Now, the town of Bremen is a little independent city-state, has about 750,000 people. And Bremen has always been a town in Germany that has been very internationalist in orientation. It was one of the founding members in the 13th and 14th century of the Hanseatic League. It was a league that sort of reached out to commerce, you know, all over Northern Europe. And Bremen was the leaving place for a high percentage of immigrants from Germany and from Europe who came to the New World. In fact, I saw a listing once of the ships that came to Houston between 1844 and 1847, and 2/3 of the ships bringing passengers to the city of Houston were from the little town of Bremen. And so Bremen, it has, in addition to this kind of internationalist orientation, it's an independent state. And it's always looked more outward than it's looked sort of internally to Germany itself. And it's strange that in Germany, a nation in which philanthropy, the idea doesn't exist. I mean, there's not a word in Germany that means philanthropy. People don't give money to art museums and universities and so forth. But Bremen has, to a unique degree, had a philanthropic tradition. It has once a year a great dinner called the Schaffenmahl, in which the leading people of the community get together and pay a huge amount of money and raise a lot of money. And this has, for almost 500 years, been an event to raise money originally to pay for the children and the orphans of sailors lost at sea. There is a public park in the city of Bremen that the people, through contributions, build up and support. So Bremen has, at least they say, a philanthropic tradition that's quite unique in Germany. Bremen also is a seaport. For years, it was one of the 2 or 3 largest seaports in Germany, but it's about 40 miles from the ocean, and it's connected by a river. So it's kind of like Houston. It's the center of the German Space Agency, so it kind of has a NASA. And that Bremen, in the 19th and early 20th century, was the largest import port for Germany of cotton from the American South, whereas Houston and Galveston was the largest export port of cotton. So in many ways, Bremen seems Houston-like. Anyway, after World War II, with Hitler defeated, and when Germany was divided up into various sections, and the section of Germany in which the city-state of Bremen is located was actually the British part of Germany. But the U.S. needed an entrepot for its forces in Germany. So Bremen and its port, Bremenhofer, were made to belong to the United States, even though it was in the British sector. And so the people in Bremen got very accustomed to and felt very friendly about U.S. involvement. And immediately after the World War II, the people of Bremen, who hadn't been big supporters of Hitler anyway, and had this sort of internationalist orientation and felt kind of bad about the Holocaust and so forth, proposed the idea of founding, using that former military base, founding an international university that would talk about peace and international understanding and so forth. And they actually talked about going to the Rockefeller Foundation in 46, 47 to make this a reality. But there were hundreds of thousands of displaced persons at the end of World War II. And the U.S. general in charge said, no, we need that foreign military base to house displaced persons. And so Bremen wasn't able to establish an international university. So it actually went to Berlin and became the Free University of Berlin. But there was an idea.